As we are now only 1 week away from Purim, we are going to be using this context as well to be discussing different topics, halacha, hashkafa of Purim. And as we know, there are 4 mitzvos of the day, Kriyas and Megillah, the Seuda, as well as Mishloach, Manos, and Matanos of Yonim. I want to focus for just a few minutes on Mishloach Manos. The Megillah tells us that the day of Purim was instituted, amongst other things, the day of Simcha Mishta V'Yom Tov Mishloach Manos Ish L'Reyehu. That one of the mitzvos mentioned already in the end of Megillah's Esther is to be sending manos, to be sending gifts to one's peer, one's friend. And there's a discussion as to what is the primary purpose. Is it to be marbe reyus, to increase friendship amongst those in Klal Yisrael? Or is it more specifically so that people can thereby fulfill their obligation of having a seuda that Mishloach Manos was instituted to be given as means to make sure that everyone can fulfill their seuda? Now, there will be nafkaminas as to whether which reason it is in terms of timing, in terms of the foods given. We know that there is an idea to be giving foods that really could be eaten as part of the seuda, things that are cooked and things that are ready to eat as is. What we are familiar with, many of us, is this idea that Mishloach Manos should be given, that one should give two different brachos as Mishloach Manos. The reality is that is actually a myth, which probably comes from another halacha. Let's look into this a little bit. So the Gemara in Megillah quotes of Yosef that says, Mishloach Manos ish l're'ehu shtei manos le'ish echad, whereas Matanos lavyonim is one gift of money to 2 avyonim, 2 poor people. Mishloach Manos is 2 gifts, two things, 2 gifts to 1 person. And that, in fact, is what the Rambam says. One has to. Why? Because Mishloach Manos, right? It's plural. The minimum of plural is 2, and therefore you should give multiple gifts to at least 1 person. But anyone who gives more, even better. We also know that the Rambam is famous for his shita that if one can increase either Mishloach Manos or Matanos Lavyonim, it is far superior to increase Matanos Lavyonim over Mishloach Manos. But nonetheless, he does write that anyone who, if you could increase, then that is better. So where does this idea of 2 brachos comes from? So probably it comes from this fact that you need 2 foods, 2 gifts, meaning 2 foods that Shulchan Aruch rules. Right, 2 types of foods, which the Aruch HaShulchan makes very, very clear that they should be 2 different categories, whether it is 1 food and 1 drink or 2 different types of food. He does say, the Aruch HaShulchan, that the Rambam, he points out that the Rambam even seems to indicate 2 gifts of meat, which seems to indicate that the Rambam is saying you only need to give maybe 2 pieces of meat. So the way that he likely differentiates is that it must mean 2 different types of meat. So 2 different tastes, 2 different cuts of meat perhaps could satisfy that, but certainly it should be 2 different categories of food to 1 person. So it need not be 2 different brachos. That is probably where people get the idea that it needs to be 2 different brachos, from this concept that it needs to be 2 different foods. You can't have 2 pieces of the same cut of meat. That would not satisfy one's requirement. But having 2 types of food, even if they are of the same bracha, would in fact satisfy one's requirement of having of giving Mishloach Manos. And whether it is because of being marbe reyus, whether it is because of making sure everyone has food for the seuda, certainly what it is the theme of the day of making sure we look out for one another, making sure we increase that reyus one way or another, making sure we show people we are thinking of them. It is a great practice to try for at least one of our Mishloach Manos to not only send to our closest friends, but to send to those who perhaps we don't typically think of. And that is a little bit about the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos.